The lake was quiet that evening, the kind of silence that seemed to wrap itself around Trevor Gaines' cabin like a protective blanket. Outside, the water reflected the pink-orange sky, a postcard scene of stillness. Inside, though, tension hummed like a live wire. Papers were spread across Trevor's oak table, maps of the subdivision, property codes printed from the county office, and handwritten notes in the Attorney General's neat script. Trevor leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had grown up knowing that even in the quietest places, trouble could find you if you didn't fit the mold. He owned this cabin outright, bought with years of overtime and sacrifice, but his neighbors, led by Judith Carraway, the iron-fisted HOA president, treated him like an intruder in his own home. Across from him sat Roland Pike, the state attorney general. His tailored suit looked slightly out of place against the log walls, but his presence brought a calm authority. He tapped a page with his pen. "Trevor, you've been more than reasonable. What they're doing, these selective fines, the intimidation, it's not just overreach. It borders on harassment. And you're not the first resident who's told me this." Trevor gave a weary laugh. "Feels like I've got a target on my back just for breathing out here." Roland met his eyes. "That's why I'm here. The law doesn't bend for convenience. Not for HOAs, not for anyone." Just as Trevor opened his mouth to reply, a sudden, violent pounding shook the cabin door. 3 heavy thuds echoed through the room, rattling the glass of the window panes. Roland's brows shot up. Trevor exhaled slowly, his chest tight. He knew that knock. It was the knock of people who believed they had power over you. "Open up," a sharp voice barked. Judith Carraway. Even muffled by the wood, her tone dripped with self-importance. Trevor pushed back his chair, steady but cautious. He walked to the door, Roland standing quietly behind him. As he pulled it open, the night air rushed in, carrying the smell of pine and lake water, and the sight of Judith, flanked by 2 county deputies. Her pearl necklace glinted against her pressed blouse, and in her hand she clutched the infamous black binder, the HOA rulebook she wielded like a weapon. The deputies, hands resting on their belts, stood stiff, their eyes scanning the inside of the cabin. Judith didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the wood. "Mr. Gaines," she announced, her voice carrying the tone of a judge delivering a sentence, "you are in direct violation of multiple HOA codes. Unauthorized dock extension. Exterior lighting past curfew. And I have reason to believe you've been conducting activities here that fall outside community standards." Trevor kept his face unreadable, though his jaw clenched. "Activities? You mean sitting in my own cabin?" Judith's eyes flicked past him and landed on Roland, who now stood tall in the warm light of the room. She frowned, momentarily thrown off. "And who exactly are you?" Roland stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Roland Pike, State Attorney General." The air seemed to thicken instantly. The deputies froze. Judith blinked, her confident posture faltering as though the ground had shifted under her. For the first time, the black binder didn't look like a weapon, it looked like a shield cracking under pressure. Trevor crossed his arms, watching her. He didn't need to say anything, Roland's presence said it all. Judith opened her mouth, shut it, then forced out a brittle laugh. "Well, regardless of titles, this community has standards, and they will be enforced. Mr. Gaines has been problematic." Roland's eyes sharpened. "Problematic? For asserting his legal right to enjoy property he owns? For following county codes while your association invents new restrictions to target him? I'd be very careful about how you proceed tonight." The deputies shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat, but neither moved forward. Judith's face flushed crimson, her binder pressed tight against her chest. For the first time in years, Trevor saw her hesitate. Outside, the lake remained calm. Inside, though, the battle lines were drawn, authority versus authority, intimidation against the weight of law. And Trevor, standing between them, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time in this cabin. Hope. The silence that followed Roland Pike's introduction was sharp enough to cut through the humid night air drifting in from the lake. The deputies, who only minutes earlier carried themselves with the swagger of enforcers, now stood uncertain, eyes flicking between Judith Carraway and the Attorney General as if waiting for someone to tell them what this moment meant. Judith, however, was not one to surrender ground easily. Her smile was brittle, her voice clipped but defiant. Attorney General or not, this is an HOA matter. Our rules are binding on every homeowner, and Mr. Gaines has shown a repeated disregard for them. Roland stepped forward, his presence filling the small cabin. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. Authority radiated from him with a steadiness that made even the deputies unconsciously straighten their spines. Mrs. Carraway, he began evenly, I've reviewed county records. Mr. Gaines' dock extension was approved by the county zoning board. His lighting complies with state safety codes. What you're attempting here is not enforcement. It's harassment. Judith stiffened, clutching her binder tighter as though it might shield her from his words. The Homeowners Association has the right to set higher standards than the county. That's why people move here, because they expect order, not chaos. He knew that when he bought. Trevor folded his arms, his voice calm but edged with frustration. I knew I was buying peace by the lake. What I didn't know was that you'd be counting porch lights and measuring grass blades like it's a crime scene. One of the deputies coughed, half hiding a smirk. Judith shot him a glare sharp enough to slice glass. She turned back to Roland, her tone icy. Regardless of county codes, Mr. Gaines has been a constant disruption. He brings in visitors at all hours, parks in ways that block common paths, and now, her eyes darted to the spread of papers on the table, he's using this property for official business? Roland's gaze didn't waver. And what business of yours is that? This is private property. Unless you hold a warrant, your intrusion tonight is not only inappropriate, it may very well be unlawful. The deputies exchanged glances, tension crackling between them. Neither had signed up for a legal showdown with the state's highest law officer. Judith faltered but quickly regained her footing, snapping her binder open. Pages fluttered like restless wings. Our covenants clearly state that all exterior modifications must receive prior approval from the board. That dock extension of his was never submitted for our review. Trevor stepped closer, pulling a folded letter from his pocket. He had kept it with him ever since the board first threatened fines. He handed it to Roland. This is my stamped approval from the county. I didn't need her permission. She just doesn't like the idea of me owning this place. Roland unfolded the letter, then held it up toward the deputies. You see the seal? That's the county authority. Higher than any HOA bylaws. What's more, selectively enforcing rules against one homeowner while ignoring others is discrimination. That's not me speculating. That's the law. The deputies looked from the seal to Judith. For the first time, it was clear they weren't backing her. Judith's jaw tightened. Her voice dropped an octave, colder now, stripped of its earlier confidence. This community relies on me to maintain its values. Without rules, everything falls apart. Roland's reply was soft, almost sympathetic, but it carried the weight of finality. Rules are meant to protect, not persecute. When they become weapons, they lose all legitimacy. And when an HOA president uses deputies to intimidate a homeowner, that's a line the law will not ignore. Trevor felt the shift in the room like a gust of fresh air. For years, Judith had towered over him and others with her endless citations and fines. Tonight, for the first time, he saw her shrinking under the weight of someone she couldn't bully. Judith snapped her binder shut, her knuckles white. This isn't over, she muttered, turning on her heel. The deputies hesitated, then followed her, leaving the cabin door wide open behind them. The cool night breeze slipped in, carrying the scent of lake water and pine. Trevor shut the door slowly, locking it this time. His heart was pounding, but not from fear. From something else. Relief. Vindication. Maybe even a spark of justice. Roland gathered the papers from the table, sliding them neatly back into his leather briefcase. That, he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth, was only the opening act. She's not going to back down quietly. But now, she knows she's not the only one holding power. Trevor let out a low laugh, half in disbelief. I've been waiting years to see her face look like that. Roland nodded. Get ready, Trevor. Tonight, you took your first step out of intimidation. From here, it's a fight for the whole community. Outside, Judith's car engine roared to life, headlights cutting across the cabin windows before disappearing down the gravel road. Inside, though, Trevor felt a stillness he hadn't known in months. For once, the cabin felt like his home again. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting golden stripes across Trevor's cabin floor. He brewed coffee, but even the rich aroma couldn't shake the unease that lingered from the night before. Judith Carraway didn't walk away because she was defeated, she walked away because she was plotting her next move. Roland Pike sat at the table again, already in a pressed shirt and jacket, leafing through a stack of HOA documents neighbors had quietly slipped to him over the past few weeks. She's been operating unchecked for years, he muttered, tapping his pen against a citation form that fined a resident $200 for a children's basketball hoop. Selective enforcement. You've been singled out, Trevor, but you're not alone. Before Trevor could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel cut through the morning calm. He peeked through the blinds. Judith's SUV was back, dust rising behind it like smoke. This time, she wasn't alone. 3 board members trailed behind her in separate cars, all carrying clipboards like a procession of authority. Trevor sighed. Round 2. When the knock came, it was less violent than the night before, but no less insistent. Trevor opened the door to find Judith standing tall, her pearl necklace gleaming in the sun. The board members fanned out behind her, forming a semicircle. This wasn't a visit, it was an ambush. Mr. Gaines, Judith began, her tone syrupy but edged with steel, we've convened an emergency board review regarding your violations. Since you refused to comply voluntarily, we've come to document and enforce compliance today. Roland stepped into view, his briefcase in hand. Enforce? You have no legal authority to enter this property without permission. And certainly not with threats of compliance. One of the board members, a thin man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, cleared his throat nervously. We're just here to observe, Judith. Maybe we should. But Judith silenced him with a sharp glance. The association's bylaws are binding. This dock extension, she pointed toward the shimmering water, was never approved. And his lighting remains in violation. We will be issuing daily fines until corrections are made. Trevor's voice hardened. The county approved my dock. I followed the law. You're not above it. Roland opened his briefcase, pulling out the stamped letter again. He held it up like a badge. Here's the official approval from the county zoning office. Higher jurisdiction than your board. Ignoring this document is not only baseless, it could expose you to legal liability for harassment. The board members shifted uneasily. One woman murmured, if the county approved it, but Judith snapped her binder open, her voice rising. The county doesn't set our standards. We do. If we allowed every homeowner to bend rules, this community would collapse into disorder. We are here to preserve value, to preserve dignity. Her eyes trilled into Trevor. And some people simply don't understand that. The undertone was unmistakable. Roland's jaw tightened. Careful with your words, Mrs. Carraway. Dignity isn't defined by who owns the home. And I will not allow you to disguise personal bias as enforcement. The deputies from the previous night weren't here, but their absence didn't make the standoff less intense. Neighbors began to appear across the road, drawn by the sight of cars clustered at Trevor's driveway. Whispers traveled quickly, and soon a small crowd had gathered at the edge of the gravel. Judith noticed the onlookers but pressed on, flipping through her binder. You've left me no choice. I'll be issuing a lien notice against this property if fines are unpaid. Trevor's stomach dropped, but Roland's calm steadied him. A lien? On a homeowner in full compliance with county code? Do you have any idea what kind of legal trouble you're inviting? He stepped closer, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Mrs. Carraway, you're abusing your position, and everyone here can see it. This isn't about lights or docks. It's about control. For the first time, Judith's board began to waver. The woman beside her looked down at her clipboard, visibly uncomfortable. The man with glasses adjusted them nervously. Only Judith held her ground, her cheeks flushed with fury. Trevor felt the tension coil in his chest. He wasn't just defending his property anymore, he was standing up to years of unchecked authority, with the law finally on his side. Roland closed his briefcase with a decisive click. This conversation is over. Any further harassment will be addressed through my office directly. And let me assure you, Mrs. Carraway, my office does not take kindly to misuse of power. The words landed like a gavel strike. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Judith's binder trembled slightly in her grip, though her face remained frozen in a mask of authority. Finally, she snapped it shut. This isn't finished, she hissed, before turning sharply toward her SUV. The board members followed, less confident now, their clipboards clutched loosely as they shuffled after her. As the cars pulled away, neighbors lingered, eyes on Trevor and Roland. Something had shifted. People who had stayed silent out of fear were starting to realize there might be room to speak up. Trevor turned to Roland, his shoulders dropping in relief. Feels like we just cracked the dam. Roland nodded, his gaze steady on the retreating cars. And when a dam cracks, it's only a matter of time before the flood comes. By the following week, it seemed like the entire town had heard about the cabin showdown. The story spread not through official channels at first, but through whispers, passed over coffee mugs in diners, across barber chairs, and whispered in pews at Sunday service. "Did you hear Judith stormed into Trevor Gaines' cabin?" someone muttered in line at the grocery store. "They say the Attorney General himself was sitting at his kitchen table," another replied, voice low with awe. By the time the Lakewood Gazette printed its headline, "HOA President Faces Off with State Attorney General," the story had already ignited like wildfire. Copies of the paper sold out by mid-morning. Some tucked it under their arms proudly, while others hid it in folded grocery bags, too nervous to be seen reading it openly. At the sheriff's office, the two deputies who had accompanied Judith that first night sat uncomfortably across from Sheriff Doug McLean. The sheriff's lined face was grim as he tapped the newspaper on his desk. "You boys dragged me into a mess I didn't ask for," he said. "Since when are we the enforcers of HOA grudges?" One deputy stammered, We thought it was just a code issue." She made it sound official. McLean's eyes hardened. "Next time, you remember this, a woman with a binder isn't the law. And if the Attorney General's breathing down my neck because of this circus, I'll make sure the blame doesn't fall on me." The deputies exchanged worried glances. They'd never seen their boss so rattled. Meanwhile, at Evelyn Park's porch, the same porch swing the HOA once forced her to take down, neighbors gathered like they used to before Judith's rules stripped joy from the community. The swing creaked softly as Evelyn poured sweet tea into mismatched glasses. "I about fell out of my chair when I read that headline," Evelyn said with a grin. Trevor standing his ground with the Attorney General backing him up? "About time somebody showed her she's not Queen of the Lake." Callie Brenner leaned forward, brushing crumbs from her lap. "She fined my kids $200 for a basketball hoop. Said it ruined the community's aesthetic. My boys never forgave me for taking it down." An older man named Frank Dillman shook his head. "I got slapped with fines 3 summers in a row for grass being an inch too tall, while her own lawn looked like a prairie." The group chuckled bitterly. But then Evelyn lowered her voice. What if this is the chance to finally push back? With Trevor and the Attorney General, maybe we've got protection now." For a moment, silence hung in the humid air. Then Callie nodded slowly. "We've been quiet too long. If Trevor can stand up to her, maybe we can too." At the library that Thursday evening, more whispers swirled. People passed clippings of the Gazette across tables. A few bold residents began printing their own flyers, listing the fines, the harassments, the petty rules Judith had enforced with military precision. One flyer read, "Enough is enough. HOA rules are for fairness, not control. Share your story." Roland Pike noticed the stirrings with quiet satisfaction. In a call with his staff, he remarked, "This isn't just about one man's dock. It's about unchecked authority. People are ready to be heard." Back at the cabin, Trevor sat on the porch steps, watching the sun dip below the trees. For years, he had felt isolated, like the community had silently agreed to let Judith's reign go unchallenged. Now, for the first time, he felt the ground shifting. Neighbors waved when they passed by on their evening walks, small gestures, but ones that hadn't happened before. Roland joined him outside, rolling up his sleeves. "The ripples have started," he said, nodding toward a pair of neighbors chatting at the end of the road. "It's only a matter of time before those ripples turn into waves." Trevor gave a half-smile, though his chest tightened with anticipation. "You think they're ready for a fight?" Roland's eyes hardened. "They don't have to be ready. They just have to be willing. And from what I'm seeing, they're more than willing." The lake shimmered in the fading light, calm for now. But Trevor could feel it, change was coming. The silence that had once defined the neighborhood was cracking open, and voices long suppressed were about to rise. Saturday afternoon, Trevor's cabin porch was more crowded than it had ever been. Folding chairs lined the edge of the deck, neighbors shifting nervously in their seats as cicadas hummed in the trees. For years, they had whispered about Judith Carraway's grip on the neighborhood. Now, for the first time, they were speaking out loud. Roland Pike stood near the doorway, sleeves rolled up, his leather briefcase resting on a small table. He looked less like a polished attorney general and more like a determined investigator. "We'll keep this informal," he assured them, his voice steady. "But everything you share matters. The law only works when the truth comes to light." Evelyn Parks, the retired teacher with her ever-present calm, spoke first. She held up a yellowing letter with the HOA's logo across the top. "This is what they sent me when they demanded I take down my porch swing. They claimed it violated safety standards." "Safety!" She shook her head, her voice trembling with both hurt and anger. "That swing was where my grandkids sat every summer. It never hurt anyone." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Next came Callie Brenner. Her hands trembled slightly as she set a faded photograph on the table. It showed two young boys grinning beside a basketball hoop in her driveway. "They fined me $200 for this," she said. "Said it didn't match community standards. Do you know what it felt like to take that hoop down while my kids watched? They cried for days." Judith didn't care. She said rules were rules. Trevor clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of their stories. He knew what it was like to feel powerless in your own home. Frank Dillman, broad-shouldered and weathered from years of carpentry, spoke next. "They hit me with fines 3 times a summer for grass being an inch too tall." "An inch." He held up his phone, flipping through pictures. "Meanwhile, I've got proof Judith's backyard was a jungle half the season. But nobody ever cited her." Roland leaned in. "May I see those?" Frank handed over the phone, and Roland scrolled carefully. The pictures didn't lie, Judith's own property in clear violation of the very rules she wielded against others. The room seemed to stiffen with a new kind of energy, anger laced with resolve. From the back, a quiet voice spoke up. A woman named Marcia, who rarely attended gatherings, stepped forward. She held up a small tape recorder, its plastic casing worn. "I don't like trouble," she began, "but I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I lived next door to Judith. Last spring, I heard her bragging on her patio." She pressed play. A crackling voice came through the recorder. Judith's unmistakable tone floated out, sharp and smug. "You have to keep people like Trevor in check, or they'll take over. If you find them hard enough, they'll either leave or learn." Gasps filled the porch. Trevor felt his chest tighten, fury rising hot and fast. Roland paused the tape, his face stone. This, Roland said evenly, is more than harassment. This is bias. This is evidence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes fiery. So what do we do? Keep meeting on porches, or finally put an end to her reign? Roland looked around at the gathered faces, neighbors who had endured years of intimidation. We bring it into the open. Quiet stories don't break chains. Public voices do. If you're willing to testify, if you're willing to stand together, we can make this bigger than Judith's binder. We can make it law. Trevor studied the group. For years, these were the same people who avoided eye contact when Judith made her rounds. Now, their shoulders were squaring, their voices steadier. Something was shifting. Callie raised her chin. I'll testify. So will I, Frank added. Evelyn nodded firmly. Count me in. Marcia hugged her tape recorder to her chest. If it helps stop her, I'll hand this over. Roland's gaze swept across them, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of a man who had stood in courtrooms and seen history turn. Then it settled. This community has been silenced too long. It's time the silence ends. As dusk settled over the lake, the porch lights flickered on, bathing the group in a soft glow. For the first time, Trevor didn't feel alone. He felt the power of voices rising, ordinary neighbors, finally ready to face the woman who had ruled them with fear. And somewhere down the road, in her pristine two-story house, Judith Carraway had no idea the tide had begun to turn. By Monday morning, the quiet lakeside town was buzzing. Word had leaked, first whispered between neighbors, then spreading like wildfire through social media, that the Attorney General himself was looking into the HOA. The sun was barely above the horizon when reporters began setting up on the courthouse lawn, their cameras pointed at a small podium hastily erected in front of the stone steps. Trevor stood off to the side, his stomach a tight knot. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. For years, he had fought his battles in silence, against letters slid into his mailbox and threats scribbled in HOA meeting minutes. Now the fight had burst into daylight. Roland Pike arrived in his usual crisp suit, though there was an intensity in his eyes that no press camera could miss. His briefcase, packed with neighbors' testimonies and Marcia's damning tape, looked heavier than it should have. He greeted Trevor with a steady handshake. Ready? Trevor swallowed. As I'll ever be. The crowd hushed as Roland stepped up to the microphone. His voice carried with a practiced clarity that silenced the rustle of papers and clicking of cameras. Good morning. Over the past week, I've listened to the voices of residents in this community, voices that have been silenced for too long. What I've heard is deeply troubling: patterns of harassment, discriminatory enforcement of rules, and abuse of authority by members of this Homeowners Association. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Roland didn't flinch. The role of an HOA is to protect and uplift a community, not to intimidate it. But what we've uncovered is something else entirely: targeted fines, selective punishments, and, in one recorded statement, openly prejudiced remarks against residents based on race. That, he said, pausing for emphasis, is not only immoral. It may be unlawful. Reporters' pens flew across notepads. One raised her hand. Attorney General Pike, are you saying this HOA could face state charges? Roland's gaze was steady. If our investigation confirms what the evidence suggests, yes. No one, no matter how powerful they believe themselves to be, is above accountability. Trevor felt a shiver as the weight of those words settled over the square. For so long, Judith Carraway had been the untouchable queen of their neighborhood. Now, the highest legal authority in the state was calling her to account. The questions kept flying. Who provided this evidence? Can you share the nature of the discriminatory remarks? How soon will charges be filed? Roland answered each with precision, never overreaching but never backing down. This isn't just about one person. This is about a culture of fear that has no place in a community meant to be home. From the crowd, Trevor saw familiar faces: Evelyn, Callie, Frank, even Marcia clutching her tape recorder like a lifeline. Their presence steadied him. Then, to everyone's surprise, Roland gestured to Trevor. "One of the individuals most affected has agreed to speak briefly today." Trevor froze. For a moment, his breath caught. Then he felt Roland's hand on his shoulder, a silent assurance. Slowly, he stepped up to the microphone. "I didn't plan to be standing here," he began, his voice rough with nerves. "I came to this town to build a life in peace. But for years, I've been treated like I don't belong in my own home. Every letter, every fine, every glare, it wasn't about rules. It was about power. About control." The cameras zoomed in, capturing his steadying breath. "But I've learned something these past few days," Trevor continued. "Judith Carraway doesn't control this neighborhood. We do. The people who live here, who care for one another, who deserve fairness and dignity, we control it. And today, thanks to the Attorney General, our voices are finally being heard." Applause broke out, not polite, but raw, heartfelt. Neighbors cheered, strangers clapped, even some reporters lowered their pens to join in. For the first time, Trevor felt like his struggle wasn't his alone. Behind the applause, however, a figure stood stiffly near the courthouse doors. Judith Carraway herself, arms folded, lips tight as a drawn bowstring. Her eyes locked on Trevor, burning with the promise of retaliation. Trevor noticed her, but for once, he didn't shrink under her glare. Instead, he lifted his chin, meeting her gaze head-on. Roland leaned back to the mic. "This is only the beginning. We will pursue the truth wherever it leads. And if that truth reveals abuse of power, then justice will follow." As the press conference ended, the flash of cameras lit the courthouse steps like a storm. But beneath the noise, Trevor felt something profound, a shift. The HOA had thrived on secrecy and silence. Now, their shadows had been dragged into the light. Judith turned sharply and disappeared into the courthouse, but the image of her rattled composure lingered. For the first time, Trevor realized she wasn't untouchable. She was afraid. And that meant the fight was far from over. The evening after the press conference, the lakefront seemed quieter than usual. But inside the Carraway household, silence was not on the menu. Judith paced her spotless kitchen, heels clacking against the polished tiles. Her phone buzzed non-stop, calls from board members, text messages from loyalists, and even one trembling voicemail from a neighbor begging, "Judith, please tell me this will all blow over." Blow over? Hardly. Judith Carraway wasn't about to watch decades of control crumble overnight. She slammed her phone onto the counter and dialed another number. After 2 rings, a sharp male voice answered. "Judith?" "Leonard, listen carefully," she hissed. Leonard was her longtime HOA vice president, a man as eager for power as she was. "We need to hit back before this nonsense spreads. Pike's making us look like tyrants. And that man, Trevor, standing there like some kind of martyr? It's a performance, nothing more." Leonard hesitated. "But the Attorney General—" "Forget the Attorney General," she snapped. "He's an outsider. He'll move on to the next headline soon enough. What matters is the community. And I won't let them turn against me." Judith leaned over her kitchen island, eyes narrowing. "We control the narrative. We always have." The very next day, an HOA newsletter arrived in every resident's inbox. Its headline blared in bold font: "Protecting our community from false allegations." Judith's words dripped with polished indignation. "Certain individuals have chosen to tarnish our neighborhood's reputation with unfounded claims. Their motives are personal, not communal. We urge residents not to be swayed by sensationalism but to remember the values that have kept our community safe and orderly for decades." Trevor read it on his porch, his blood running hot. Safe and orderly? He glanced at the lake, at the water that had been his one escape from HOA harassment. Safe wasn't the word he would use. Roland arrived later that afternoon, a copy of the newsletter in hand. "She's playing her hand fast," he said grimly. She's rallying her loyalists. Can she get away with this? Trevor asked. Roland gave a wry smile. She can try. But smear campaigns only work if people stay silent. The question is, will your neighbors speak louder than her lies? That evening, Judith called an emergency HOA meeting in the community clubhouse. Chairs were arranged in rigid rows, a lectern polished to gleam under the fluorescent lights. Judith stood tall at the front, pearls around her neck, her tone smooth as glass. My friends, she began, we've been misrepresented. Painted as villains in our own story. But we know the truth. We've kept this community beautiful, safe, and valuable for years. And now outsiders, politicians, opportunists, are trying to dismantle what we've built. Some heads nodded, others shifted uneasily. Evelyn Parks stood up, her voice steady. Judith, no one's dismantling anything. We just want fairness. Judith's smile tightened. Fairness? Is it fair to have basketball hoops cluttering our streets? Is it fair to let grass grow wild? Is it fair to have cabins painted colors that drag down property values? Callie rose, fire in her eyes. Is it fair to humiliate kids? To tear down family traditions? To fine people for breathing wrong if you don't like them? Gasps echoed. For the first time, Judith's confidence flickered. But she recovered quickly, turning the crowd. Don't be fooled, she warned. These accusations are meant to divide us. Do you want our property values to crash? Do you want strangers dictating how we live? The room buzzed with confusion, some swayed by her fear tactics, others emboldened by the truth rising in their chests. Trevor, standing near the back, finally stepped forward. His voice cut through the noise. We're not strangers, Judith. We are this community. And for once, we're not afraid to say it. The room fell silent. Judith's eyes bore into him, cold and sharp as daggers. You're making a mistake, Trevor, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. A mistake you'll regret. But Trevor didn't flinch. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, many nodding, many standing a little straighter. Judith's threats didn't land the way they once did. For the first time, she saw her grip loosening. And it terrified her. That night, Judith sat alone in her grand dining room, sipping wine that did nothing to calm her nerves. The newsletter hadn't silenced the rebellion. The meeting hadn't restored her control. And Pike wasn't going away. Her reflection in the glass looked less like a queen and more like a cornered figure. But Judith Carraway wasn't finished. If anything, she was more dangerous than ever. Because when power slips through your fingers, you don't let go quietly, you claw it back. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and nerves. Sunlight slanted through high windows, catching the polished wood of the benches where neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder. For months, whispers had ruled the community. Today, those whispers had turned into testimony, and all eyes were fixed on the front where Judith Carraway sat at the defense table. She looked different now, her posture still rigid, but her usual confidence cracked. Her pearls clutched her neck like chains rather than trophies. She avoided the stares of those she had fined, humiliated, and controlled for years. Trevor sat in the gallery beside Evelyn, Callie, and Frank. Roland Pike stood at the prosecution's table, methodically arranging documents, his expression cool but relentless. He looked every bit the attorney general who had spent his career dismantling corruption. When the judge entered, the room stilled. Today's hearing will address the matter of alleged misconduct, harassment, and discriminatory enforcement by the Lakewood Homeowners Association, specifically its president, Mrs. Judith Carraway, the judge intoned. Judith's lawyer rose first, painting her as a misunderstood leader. My client has only ever sought to uphold the standards of her community. These accusations are exaggerated, emotional, and politically motivated. But when Roland stepped forward, his voice was iron. Your Honor, this case isn't about politics. It's about power, misused, abused, and hidden behind the veneer of community rules. We will show that Mrs. Carraway and her board acted not as protectors of the neighborhood but as tyrants targeting residents selectively, often with clear racial bias. The first witness was Evelyn. Her hands trembled as she held up the yellowing letter demanding the removal of her porch swing. This wasn't about safety, she said, her voice quivering. It was about control. They wanted to take away the small joys that made our houses feel like homes. Next came Callie, her faded photograph of the basketball hoop passed to the judge. My children still ask why their friends couldn't play in our driveway. I had no answer. Because rules are rules wasn't the truth. The truth was, Judith just didn't want certain families to feel welcome. Frank followed, his photos of Judith's own unkempt yard flashing on a screen for the courtroom. She fined me 3 times a summer for grass being an inch too tall. Meanwhile, her yard looked like a jungle. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was enforcing herself. Finally, Marcia, the soft-spoken neighbor, stepped forward clutching her recorder. The tape crackled, then Judith's unmistakable voice filled the courtroom. You have to keep people like Trevor in check, or they'll take over. If you find them hard enough, they'll either leave or learn. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Trevor felt his stomach clench, then release. The truth was out, not whispered, not hidden, but exposed under the full light of law. Judith's lawyer sputtered, but even he seemed shaken. Judith herself sat stone-faced, lips thin, eyes darting, as though searching for a crack in the wall closing in on her. Roland let the silence stretch before speaking. This isn't leadership. This is prejudice weaponized. This is abuse of power. And it has no place in this state. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped. Mrs. Carraway, this court will not issue a final ruling today. But based on the testimonies and evidence presented, I am ordering a full state investigation into your leadership of this HOA, with immediate suspension of your authority pending review. The words landed like a gavel strike even before the actual gavel fell. Judith flinched, her carefully constructed image fracturing in public view. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. But this time, Trevor didn't shy away. Standing with Roland and his neighbors, he faced the microphones. His voice was steady, clear. For years, we were told to stay quiet, to keep our heads down, to not rock the boat. But silence only gives bullies more power. Today, we learned that when a community stands together, even the strongest walls of intimidation crumble. Cheers rose from the crowd. Reporters shouted questions, flashes sparked, but all Trevor felt was the weight lifting from his shoulders. Beside him, Evelyn smiled through tears. Callie squeezed his arm. Frank clapped him on the back. And Roland, ever the steady force, leaned in and said quietly, "This isn't just a win for you. It's a win for every community that's been afraid to speak." Trevor looked back at the courthouse steps where Judith had once stood smug and untouchable. Now she walked out flanked by her lawyer, shoulders slumped, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. No longer a queen, just a woman stripped of her crown. The lake breeze swept through the crowd, cool and fresh. For the first time in years, Trevor inhaled deeply, feeling the freedom of air untainted by fear. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, and the fight wasn't over. But one truth rang clear: Judith Carraway's reign of fear had ended. And in its place, a community was being reborn.